Hey everyone, Greg from My Mortgage here. Just finishing off our construction lending series. We've covered things from fixed price contracts, house and land packages, turnkey, relocatables and transportable homes, self-managed builds, kit sets, things like that. So if you haven't seen those videos, go and check them out. Today we're just going to cover some of the frequently asked questions we get about construction lending. So if you're building a house and you're not obviously living in it while you're building, you will need to be paying rent or your previous mortgage while that house is being built in a fixed price contract. However, one thing to note is that while you're building the property, you'll only be paying interest, not the principal, on the lending amount. And normally with a fixed price contract, you'll be drawing down over time. So initially you might even have a really small home loan for that lending and for the construction. And then as you get further along the process, obviously it will be bigger, but it will still only be interest only. One thing to note is it will be on the floating interest rate. We can't fix a mortgage while you're drawing down on it, can't fix that home loan. So that's how you need to think about it. Yes, you will need to be paying rent or your current mortgage, but it will be less than the entire mortgage at the end. So definitely something to factor in when you're doing your sums. So you've got friends and family who are tradies and they're going to help you build your house and do it at a cheaper rate. That's great. There are ways that you can do that. We just need to be careful with how that's approached. So the easiest thing is talk to your builder about seeing if they can get the cost of that particular thing. So say for example you've got a brother who's an electrician, talk to your builder about getting him to use your brother to do the electrical work for the property, to give him a price. So your brother will give the builder a price, add that into the contract, and then it's all just part of that one contracted price, the fixed price contract that the builder is giving you. And then you can use your brother. He might charge a discounted rate. That's great. And then at the end, everything will kind of work out. You just need to then borrow less than what their bank originally said that they would lend you. Or potentially the builder has already factored in the discount and what that's going to be, and then the overall price would just be lower. So yes, it can be done. If it's the entire build, because you have a family who are all, or friends who are a building company, a little bit more complex. And what may need to happen there is they may need to initially quote the entire amount like a normal build, because otherwise the banks are going to question why that build is so cheap. And then when you get to the end, there's some ways that we can work around that so that it's going to come out that it's going to cost you less, and the house is already built and the bank is like, great, that the house was built for a cheaper price. So yes, there are some ways that that can be done. So we're very lucky that in New Zealand that we've had KiWISAVER now running for about 13 or 14 years. And so now lots of people have a really good deposit for houses. And yes, you can use your KiWISAVER when you build a house. So that's a great starting point for getting a deposit. And also a part of that is what's called the first home grant. And this is if you've been contributing to KiWISAVER for more than 3 years, between 3 and 5 years, you can get up to $10,000 to go towards a build. If you're buying an existing property that's been built 20 years ago, you can get up to $5,000. But when you build brand new, the government will give you $10,000. So that's a really good incentive to look at building as an option. Again, much easier to use when you're doing a house and land package because there's a nice fixed price and you know what it's going to end up being, needing to stay under those regional price caps. But there is really good reason to use your KiWISAVER and the Home Start grant, now called the First Home Grant, to build a property as your first home. So historically, yes, it has been a little bit easier to fund builds when you have less than a 20% deposit. And the reason for that was up until April 2020, there was what's called LVR restrictions, loan to value ratio restrictions, which meant the banks were limited how much they could lend if you didn't have a 20% deposit. However, those have been removed, and so now it doesn't really make a difference whether you're buying existing or building. The banks don't have the same restrictions on them in terms of what they're allowed to lend. However, you still need to meet the same criteria if you don't have a 20% deposit. So making sure you've got low existing debt, making sure you've got the right amount of income to finance that debt, and then thirdly, making sure you've got good account conduct and character. Basically, that means you're making any repayments on time for existing debt that you might have. You are not using overdrafts incorrectly, those sorts of things. So yes, you can get lending for building if you don't have a 20% deposit. Most of the time those are for house and land packages and turnkey builds, just because those are more fixed prices rather than some of the other types of lending which can have variations in them. So with most types of construction lending, you don't need to pay both principal and interest while you're going through the build. So what the banks do is, because you're drawing down on the loan throughout the whole build, you only pay interest on that lending as you go, and you pay the floating rate, which is normally slightly higher than the fixed rate. And so if that's the case, you want to do your numbers based on an interest-only loan and using that floating rate. So if you jump onto our website, there is a calculator there, which is the interest-only calculator. So mymortgage.co.nz under the calculators section. And that'll tell you what you'll be paying at each step. Now, when we get to the end and you get code of compliance, so the house is completely finished and the local council is happy with it, at that point, then we can jump back in and refix your mortgage for you, get it onto a nice interest rate, depending on what structure you're wanting. You might want to leave some of it floating to pay it off quicker. You might need a revolving credit that you can draw down on later, or potentially you want to fix the entire amount. We can work with you on that structure. But when you're actually going through the build, you might be paying rent or mortgage somewhere else. And so you want to make sure that you know what your repayments are going to be, interest only, and using that floating rate as you go.